Maria, good evening, and thanks so much for your time.
Good evening.
So, I mean, just hearing what the MEC has had to say already, suspending the principal, letters about to be served on the district officials, and we're also looking at the role of the school governing body as well. Now, anybody who has questions about, okay, the principal was not at the campus, as far as we know he wasn't, the district officials were not there, and as far as we know, school governing body members were not there. So is it fair for responsibility to extend? I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
Sure.
Yeah.
So obviously we would look at the persons who were primarily responsible for the children involved, first and foremost. But I think in situations like this, one would want to look a little bit further and see who is responsible for those individuals responsible for children. And there is a thing in our law called vicarious liability, which means that an employer of a certain individual may be responsible for that person's wrongdoing in certain circumstances, such as, for example, where they're in the course of their duties, as the teachers may have been in this particular case.
So this was an unauthorized visit, as the MEC has confirmed, saying that there was an application made, but it wasn't made in the time frame that an application should have been made. This should have happened at some point towards the end of last year, I'm assuming, and that they went on this trip anyway, so the stamp of approval was not given. So I'm assuming in that case, therein comes in the school principal, because he would know that this was going ahead anyway, or unless, you know, they delegate to such an extent in the school that it doesn't actually pass his table. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I would imagine that a principal would be responsible for that, and what happens with his staff and what steps his staff take. So I would understand that, you know, I would accept that going that far would be quite fair. We don't know whether, if application had been made timeously, it would have been received. So I'm not sure that we can pin everything onto that failure.
Yeah. Well, and also the questions around the school governing body, Maria, you know, that's come up, and I'm not sure as to, you know, what role they would have played, whether they have any part to play in applying for a trip, with applying for permission as well. But in general, can we voice some responsibility?
Look, I don't know that a governing body is involved in the day-to-day operations of a school. I would think that a governing body sits to look at strategy, to look at finances, to look at, you know, how do we want to develop the school, where do we want to open it up to, what new activities do we want to introduce. And I don't know that they would know of the day-to-day operations. So I think it may seem a little bit unfair to try and hold them responsible. Although in the chain of vicarious liability, even though somebody in charge doesn't know that something is happening down the line, it may be their duty to know.
So other very, very disturbing details coming up over the past couple of days, talking about what the teachers who were at the camp, let's go there now, the teachers who were at the camp, what they were doing, apparently playing games, while these kids were out on rafts that they made, pieces of wood or bamboo tied together with shoelaces. So, I mean, there for me lies the biggest problem, apart from it being an unauthorized trip as well, and the fact that there was no roll call that was done and the list was left on the bus. I mean, that is a very scary thought, especially for someone who's a parent.
Absolutely. Look, when it comes to children, you would have heard a lot of us attorneys say there is a higher duty of care in respect of those people who are responsible for them.
Explain that to us. Yeah.
So what that means is when somebody is looking after children or looking after somebody else, they have a duty to look after them as if they were their parents. So if somebody is handing over a child to me and I am the caregiver, the minder, who's going to be looking after that child for the day, I take responsibility as if I am the parent. And when it comes to children, the duty to exercise that care is higher than it would be, for example, if I was in the company of another adult. If I could give an example, where children, these particular children are 13-year-old and so on, and they are embarking on an activity which somebody might say is a dangerous activity, once again the duty increases. So hearing reports that the teachers were not supervising and were playing games rather than supervising this particular activity are a little bit alarming.
And also the actions afterwards. I mean, according to some of the pupils, from what we heard, according to some reports, that they went to teachers and said this has happened, but the search for this child only began, I think it was a day later, if it was, whatever it was way too late. And that the issue of a roll call, for me, that is where the first problem was in the first place, not knowing who was in your care.
Yes.
And I mean, I would imagine that that would play a big part in determining
so
how they acted.
the things that we look for is how far the person responsible, the one that we want to hold responsible, what we call the wrongdoer, how far has that person's conduct deviated from the standard of the reasonable person. You may have heard the term the reasonable man test. What that means is we look to the community and we take a nominal person in the street and we say, if that was a reasonable person in these circumstances, how would he or she have reacted? And then we look at the actual person that we are calling the wrongdoer and we say how far have they deviated from what the reasonable person would have done? And we call that negligence. Now, in this particular case, it would certainly appear that if somebody is not supervising children where they ought to be and they are not taking roll call or making sure that they have accounted for all the children in their care, that we can say that that deviates from what a reasonable person in those circumstances would have done. And in that case, they would be negligent.
So the MEC is saying that every teacher who was there is going to be individually charged, as we just said a few moments ago. So what would be the charge in this case, given everything you've just explained?
So when I hear the words charged, I imagine it would be criminal charges.
Yes.
And there are two tests. One is whether we can hold those persons civilly accountable. And in that particular case, one would sue for damages. In the other circumstances, one would charge them with criminal proceedings, like, for example, in this case, it would be culpable homicide, which would mean the negligent death, causing a death of somebody negligently.
And, I mean, and I know everyone's been talking about indemnity since this came up, and this wouldn't cover them in any way. And all of this while we're still waiting to hear what actually happens to the owners of the lodge, or those who were running the lodge at the time.
Yes.
That's still out in the cold, yeah.
So the way I see it, there are two parties that could be held liable, and I'm talking in the civil sense, not in the criminal sense. One would look at the school first and what duties the teachers had to supervise the boys in respect to that particular activity, because it may be that it wasn't their duty to supervise at that particular time, and they may have handed over responsibility to the lodge and its employees to conduct the activity or to supervise the activity. So either one of those two, or the employees of either one of those two entities, may be held responsible. Now, when we talk about indemnities, very often when children are going to go onto a school outing or something, the school would require the parents to sign what we call an indemnity form. And essentially what that document is to limit or to exclude liability on the part of the school or perhaps a third-party vendor in respect of any damages that may arise. Usually those indemnities apply, but they don't apply in respect of gross negligence or intentional conduct.
Games while children are in water.
If we can classify that as gross negligence, then yes.
Okay, well, we'll have to wait and see what happens. We'll hear from the MEC in just a little while. Hopefully, we will be allowed into that meeting. Thank you very much, Marie Philippides, for that insight.